A peaceful day, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are right now. We're being in a global locations for this webinar. And thank you all to our speakers and to our participants who are joining us today in our webinar called Global NATO Implications for the Asia Pacific Part 2. So this one will going to focus on the effects of NATO in Asia Pacific. And having with me today is our co-moderator as well, Jean Gisiste Jr. Gisiste from the Philippines, and also our fellow speakers that will be joining us today, Cora Fabros, Manette Francis, Daehoon Lee, Teresa Ariola, and DJ Jr. from the Philippines too. And so before we start, let me just share you a quick video.
Aloha, hafade, everybody. My name is Nake Flores, and I'm a member of Pratehila Texan Favoritidian and Independent Guahan, and I live in Guam. And last week, when we heard about this recent contamination, the spill of 1,300 gallons of AEPF, it was with a great sense of urgency that we felt the need to actually come here to stand in solidarity. And so we are tremendously humbled to be here with all of you today, to stand in solidarity with all of you. We have this banner here. It says, Lena'la Ihanam, water is life in Chamorro. And this is a miniature version of the giant banner we held at our Red Hill Solidarity event a year ago. 1 year ago, at home, we had a solidarity event for Red Hill, and we couldn't bring that banner. So my friend Joey Certeza made this just the day before we left. Right now, our group is involved in a similar fight. We have a sole source aquifer that is extremely vulnerable to military contamination. A firing range being constructed where they will fire off 7 million ammunitions a year right over our aquifer. Just a couple years ago, we had a jet fuel spill which destroyed 500 tons of soil. This is horrible destruction that will impact many, many generations from now. Right now, our group is fighting open burning and open detonation, again, on ancestral land. We are all sick and tired. Who are they keeping safe? Who are they keeping safe? Nobody. We have a common enemy. We have a common enemy. This hazardous waste, we didn't put it here. The military put it here. The colonizer put it here. It's time to demilitarize the Pacific, decolonize Oceania, and we are stronger together. We are stronger as a Pacific family. Thank you all so much, Sainamasi. I send so much kunaiza, bula kunaiza from Guam to every single one of you. Sainamasi, everybody.
So to begin this video, this week is also the Global Week of Action for Peace and Climate Justice. So this is one of the advocacy effort also in Asia Pacific that strongly call for disarmament and for environmental sustainability in the area. So for today to start, to give us the overview on what's happening in Asia Pacific and what's currently going on in there, and what's the NATO's presence in the region. We will have our first speaker today, Ms. Cora Fabros. And Ms. Cora Fabros is the current co-president of IPB and very active in Asia People's Forum and ASEAN People's Forum. So she leads also the Stop the War Coalition Philippines and Nuclear Philippines, and serve as the Philippines focal point for the Nukes Asia Forum and advocating against nuclear power and promoting renewable energy. And currently also, she led one of the successful campaigns to stop the nuclear power projects and to close the U.S. military bases in 1992. Without further ado, would like to welcome Ms. Cora Fabros as our first speaker. Ms. Cora, the floor is.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. It was a long introduction. Anyway, and I'd like to, on behalf of the International Peace Bureau, I'd like to welcome our speakers, resource persons, and our participants into to this webinar today. Well, of course, we'd like to also let you know that this webinar aims to deepen the analysis of NATO's presence in the region and explore the intersectionality of military security, geopolitics, peace, and environment, and provide insights into alternative approaches to security in the Asia-Pacific region. NATO has been extending its influence into the Asia-Pacific through political and military partnerships. So a lot of that happened in recent years, especially in the last 2 or even 1 year ago. In the recent summit in Washington, D.C., NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg highlighted that Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand share security threats that could affect Europe in particular. And despite their recent involvement, these nations have historically had little connection to NATO's traditional security agenda. At this point, I'd like to read part of Professor Chenoy's article last August at In-Depth News, which clearly defines NATO's policy in the Indo-Pacific region. I felt that this is a valuable information and analysis that we can share today. And I quote, NATO's forward policy into the Indo-Pacific frames China as a big threat and a decisive enabler of the Russian-Ukraine war. North Korea is the second US target here because of its new military partnership with Russia. This is leading to changes in military security landscape. And I think this is worth, looking at. Currently, this is something that our part 1 speakers have also expounded on. The US NATO's method in the Indo-Pacific theater is to fuse itself onto existing regional tensions that were earlier bilaterally handled. These tensions include those between the Philippines and China, North and South Korea, Vietnam and China, India and China, and so on and so forth, which we continue to see the evolution up to this day. NATO's scheme is to superimpose its own agenda here by creating intersecting networks of military agreements like Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States, which is true for AUKUS, that will provide Australia with nuclear submarines and additional US bases and military arrangements in the Philippines that will bring Japanese and Australian troops as the Philippines' relation with China deteriorate. We also see the South Korea, Japan, US triad that puts South Korea in a US-led extended deterrence called the Korea three-axis system with the first strike preemptive strategy that targets North Korea. In response, the North Korea has signed a military agreement with Russia. And Russia has option to assert its role as an Indo-Pacific power and as a strategic partner to China and North Korea. And Indo-Pacific is on a dangerous path of militarization. NATO's growing presence in the Asia-Pacific region is intensifying military tensions and reshaping security dynamics. By positioning China as a major threat and targeting North Korea for its ties with Russia, NATO and the US are inserting themselves into regional conflicts previously managed bilaterally. This includes providing Australia with nuclear submarines, as Professor Chenoy earlier, as I quoted Professor Chenoy earlier. And also we see the establishment of US bases in the Philippines through the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement and involving Japanese and Australian troops. We also see NATO's $1.3 trillion this military expansion last year resulted in 233 million metric tons of carbon emissions, worsening the climate crisis. The Transnational Institute warned us that this spending increases emissions naturally and diverts funds from climate action and fuels instability. Despite the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, a call for a 43% emissions reduction by 2030, NATO's emissions rose by 15% in 2023, and it's expected to continue this trend this year and even next year. We deeply appreciate the presence of our panel of speakers today, as they each bring us valuable information, analysis, and energies from the front line of their resistance, all of them coming from hotspots of militarism and people's resistance in Asia and the Pacific. That's the main reason why we have 4 of our panelists today to give us an overview as well of what's going on in the region, the impact of NATO, impending NATO presence, as well as hopefully, and I think that Professor Chenoy will be able to kind of present us with some alternatives that we can pursue, especially in the Asia-Pacific region.
Thank you, Ms. Cora, for giving us the overview on the implications of implications of NATO in the Asia Pacific. And now we'll go more into deeper analysis per country on what's the effect on their country and their context of the NATO, and does it really affect them, or is it for good or for bad? And to give us those critical analysis, we will have the first speaker that will be introduced by co-moderator Jean Gissystem. Jean?
Thank you very much, Michelle. And once again, thank you very much, Cora, for providing, the overall context about NATO's presence in the Asia Pacific. So to introduce our next speaker, We have Annette Brownlee, who has been active in the peace movement for over 40 years, participating in People for Nuclear Disarmament in the 1980s and the climate movement in the early 1990s. She co-convened Just Peace Queensland and has chaired the Independent and Peaceful Australian Network, or IPAN, since 2013. Annette also co-founded the Pacific Peace Network and serves on Just Peace Queensland's coordinating committee. She advocates for alternatives to war, speaks at public forums, and recently oversaw IPAN's People's Inquiry on Australia's involvement in US-led wars. Annette, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Jean, and thanks for inviting me to speak here tonight. I come to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people, who are the traditional owners of the land around Brisbane, otherwise known as Mianjin. So it's important to recognise that we, as white people in this continent called Australia, are the product of colonisation here of a people that lived in this land for 60,000 years. And I'd like to pay my respects to those people. I'll also come to you just having returned from the city centre, where I attended a rally where people came together to grieve, to be angry about what's happening in Lebanon and Gaza. The situation there is really, truly horrendous, and there was a large crowd of people there tonight. It made me think that 13 years ago, when Obama announced the Pacific pivot, that in fact, you know, America would be so tied up in the Western Pacific, and that, you know, that Europe would be left alone. But that wasn't to be. As we know, the United States is very much involved in both the Ukrainian war and also with arming Israel to conduct the genocide that's happening there as we speak. And seeing those families and children who are losing their lives there is truly distressing. So it's great to have an opportunity to talk with people from other parts of the Pacific and Asia. I think that's really important. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about, you know, the issues that concerning Australia and the peace movement in Australia. And of course, the big one, which you've all heard about, is AUKUS. That decision to create this agreement was done in secrecy and dropped on us in 2022. Since then, there's been growing opposition to the implications, the costs and consequences of this military agreement between the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia, done without any political approval from the Parliament. No debate was held in the Parliament. It was just handed down. And so that in itself is a big issue for a lot of people. The other issue that has constantly been raised is our sovereignty and our ability to stand separately to any future military actions that the United States decides to undertake. Australia has been complicit in wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, now also I'd add Syria and Ukraine, and now in Gaza and Lebanon. We're complicit because we just follow the United States. We are not critical of the role that the United States plays in each of these wars. And 1,000 people in the city tonight were affirming their understanding of the role of the United States in each of these wars. You know, AUKUS has been a huge thing for us in terms of the impact on us economically. Huge amounts of money being spent on the military now in Australia. Apart from the $368 billion that's been allocated to purchase the nuclear submarines, which may or may not ever eventuate, to be honest. There's a lot of speculation about whether, in fact, they will eventuate and we'll just be pouring money down the drain, money that should have been spent on health and education and addressing climate change. But no, we're off and running, paying all this money. And I guess the other cost is our relationships with peoples in our region. I think there's a great suspicion about Australia being the deputy sheriff of the United States. And, you know, that interferes with us having a close and workable relationship with people in the region in which we live. So just in case you don't know, AUKUS has two pillars, and one of them is, the first one is the submarines. The second one, though, is really about technology and development of technology to fight wars. So a lot of money going into this as well. The other thing is that educational institutions, universities, technical colleges, even high schools have been railroaded into the excitement of science and technology. But the excitement is about developing skills in these areas. So I'll just quickly list some of the areas that Pillar 2 covers, and it's the undersea capability, you know, and that's one of the reasons why we doubt whether the submarines will ever eventuate, because they're putting a lot of money into autonomous drones that may very well replace submarines. Quantum technologies with partners aiming to deliver generation after next quantum capabilities. AI and autonomy, everyone's talking about that. Advanced cyber capabilities, hypersonic and counter-hypersonic capabilities, and innovation, all couched in this kind of excitement that we're going to be building this wonderful, skilled young workforce that's in reality is all directed at the potential for Australia to be a launching pad for a United States war against China, or anywhere else for that matter. So currently, you know, our defence budget is sitting at around about 2.1%. It's projected in 10 years to go up to $100 billion a year, which is 2.4% of our GDP. So, and this is not about the defence of Australian territory. It's about force projection on behalf of the United States. We have a number of books coming out in Australia by various writers, not necessarily from the left, as you might expect. One from the Lowy Institute, which is a think tank that's always been on the conservative side of what they propose. And a guy there called Sam Roggeveen has written a book called The Echidna Strategy, which is in fact an alternative. He's putting forward the alternative to relying or falling in line with the United States plan for Australia to be a forward base. But I don't know whether you know what an echidna is, but it's got little spiky spines all over it. And in essence, it means that, you know, you can have a defense strategy where the spines are down, you're not sort of really being aggressive. But if somebody does try to attack you or attack your territory, then the spines can come up and you're prepared for that eventuality. So, you know, most people in Australia, citizens, expect us to have a defence force. But what we have, in fact, fallen into is being an offence army on behalf of the United States. So we've also had a number of previous leaders now really speaking out quite loudly, prime ministers and foreign ministers. We ran a webinar just last week with a former foreign minister speaking at that webinar, where he described AUKUS as the worst foreign policy decision Australia has ever made. Now, that may not actually be the case. I think about joining in with the war in Vietnam, where 3 million people died as a result of that war, and Australia was complicity in it. But nevertheless, that's the extent at which we're now hearing from former Labor leaders, but also, in fact, from one of the Prime Minister's Conservative Party, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who's also been very condemning of the decision to host AUKUS. So, you know, from a military perspective, what has happened is the north of Australia has been identified as the most significant area in which to base their warfighting capabilities. And Darwin, sleepy little Darwin, has been turned into a very busy military town. Darwin Airport has been, a section of Darwin Airport has been taken over for American aircraft use. Out on one of the edges of the city, we have now taken much of that aircraft fuel that Nick talked about in her little film introduction, which was fantastic. And we're now storing vast sums of aircraft fuel for use. You can only think for use in the event that there would be a war and an aggressive use of that by US Air Force, as well as Australian Air Force, I suppose. So many people see what's happened in Darwin as providing closer range also for a war on China, and with the ability to play a role in blocking the sea routes where China relies still on the supply of fuel to be transported through those waters. The sort of story that we're given here is that we need to protect those straits of water from China from blocking the access. It is just ridiculous, you know, and defies any intelligent thinking through. Australia has as its biggest trading partner, on which we are absolutely dependent for our economy, is trade with China. Were there to be a war with China, it would be an absolute disaster economically for Australia. Even a serious sort of conflict, if it was pre-war, would be a serious threat to our economy. And in fact, at this very moment, our Treasurer is in Beijing talking with Chinese counterparts, which I'm very pleased about. And that's a very healthy sign that we have one of our most senior leaders in China at this point in time. And that is reassuring. So the agreement, as I said, effectively makes us a base in the Asia Pacific from which to advance a war on America's behalf. After the Pacific pivot, not long after, just 2 years after, Australia did sign a legal document with the United States called the Force Posture Agreement. And when Cora mentioned the Enhanced Cooperation Agreement, I think effectively it's the same thing. It's about legally handing over your territory for use by the American military. So I won't talk for too much longer because I think we've got some really special speakers. We're about to hold our biennial conference in Perth. The reason that we chose to have the conference in Perth is because of the upgrading of the Stirling Naval Base, where we will be, and already are, hosting US and UK nuclear submarines. Now, our government has accepted the condition that has been placed on us to neither confirm nor deny whether those vessels are carrying nuclear weapons. So the whole area around Perth could in fact become a huge security area, given that, you know, both being nuclear powered but potentially carrying nuclear weapons puts that area at great risk in the event of a conflict, but also in the event of some accidental release of radioactive material into the region. It's a pristine region. You know, that part of Western Australia is just so beautiful. The water is so aquamarine, and it has all these wonderful marine life in and around Garden Island, where this naval base is positioned on. So, you know, the environmental impacts of this preparation for war must be highlighted, as is, you know, all of the other risks and threats that are involved. So I'll finish up there, and just to encourage any of you who would like to join us at the IPAN conference, you can join via Zoom. And Michelle, if you could let everyone know the arrangements for the IPAN conference and how to register to attend that, even for part of either Saturday or Sunday. We will be having a protest down at the naval base as well, for those that are there in person. Thank you very much for your time to listen to what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annette. That's very, you give us a clear picture on what's happening in Australia and what's the effect politically, economically, to the people, to the environment. It's just, I could vividly picture of it, like if something comes to worse in the future. But without further ado, thank you so much. And we will have the one of the closest region in Australia, our neighbor from the Philippines, Miss DJ Junior. Miss DJ is from Stop the War Coalition. She's currently the Secretary General of Unity of Women for Freedom, or Kaisaka, a feminist federation of women that works toward consciencing women to reclaim and assert their rights and welfare. And also, she is the current part of the executive committee as vice president of the Freedom Deaf Coalition, and part of the human rights movement in defense of human rights and dignity, or IDefend. And currently, she's the head of the Secretariat of Stop the War Coalition Philippines. So, without further ado, Miss DJ Junior, the floor is yours.
Um, Thanks for the opportunity to share our thoughts and stance on this matter. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's growing presence in Asia and the Pacific through the United States, which has strategic interest in this region, it has, of course, far-reaching implications in our collective futures, sovereignty, and commitment to peace. Under the President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the Philippines' foreign policy is moving towards deeper involvement in the U.S. military-industrial complex. Filipinos are misled into thinking that this alliance will ensure stability, enhances defense capabilities, but it's the opposite. It will not uphold peace, it does not put a premium on diplomacy, and it subverts any exercise of genuine national independence. So, of course, we know that NATO is born from the crucible of war and is a defensive alliance for Europe and North America. Unfortunately, it's extending its reach beyond its original borders into the Asia and the Pacific region. It has formed alliances with the U.S., allies like Japan, Australia, and South Korea, and of course the Philippines. In fact, the U.S. describes my country as a major non-NATO ally. History teaches us that when foreign powers extend their influence into new regions, the costs are often borne by local populations, the very people they claim to protect and to secure. This is no less true given the history of the Philippines, which is a history of repeated colonization, occupation, and neocolonization. Now we see the Philippines is being dragged into the front lines in a potential global superpower confrontation. So as the Marcos Jr. is expanding its military ties with the United States and embracing a larger role in the U.S. military-industrial complex, it is positioning the Philippines as a key ally in this new era of geopolitical competition. Actually, recently, last April, the Philippines was part of the recipient of military aid given out by the United States, part of a 95 billion military aid package that was given also. Some of that money, some of it was given to Israel, some of it was given to Ukraine, and around $500 million was given to the Philippines. Actually, based on CIPRI data, last April it was my country was spending $35 per capita. Now, when we checked it again, it's now $46 per capita. If you compare that with the cent, it is spending for basic uh, services for citizens like housing and education. That's really far off. So this is all done under the guise of defense cooperation. So that's the line that they're trying to rally behind, or the people support on this further involvement in with the United States. So with that cover, we have seen, as Cora Fabros has already mentioned, a reactivation of U.S. military bases. But this is no longer the old type of bases. These are the cooperative security locations variety. So what are cooperative security locations? These are non-U.S. facilities that are maintained with the sporadic support from the U.S. military or the host nation, which is the case of the Philippines. These locations provide rotational foreign military forces with logistical support and contingency access. Further, we have already monitored 300 or so more joint exercises in a year with the United States and its allies, which are growing exponentially in terms of participating foreign militaries, participating number of troops, and the breadth of the immense area and provinces that it is involving in all its exercises, including our airspace and of course our ocean. But of course, we are clear that it is not about security, it is about power. In the past, the Philippines have already been used as a pawn in historical power battles. And now we are being groomed again to become a buffer zone or a staging ground for military operations well beyond our borders. Because, of course, we are just next door to flashpoints like the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. And we are ideal for projecting the military might of the United States and its allies. But of course, that also likewise poses a danger to us when tensions rise. It is still a mystery because last January, 39 million gallons of military fuel from the Hawaii U.S. Navy facility Red Hill, which was being closed down because of contamination and of the public outcry of the advocates there. 39 million gallons of military fuel was shipped from Hawaii to Subic, unbeknownst to everybody. So it's still, but to the news in Hawaii at least, it is supposed to be used for operations in the South China Sea. So up to this day, there is no word what happened to the fuel. So we see that the United States military-industrial complex, which is of course a large and powerful self-perpetuating system that thrives on conflict and encourages militarism, is at the heart of this matter. We know that it is through continued weapons production, military bases construction, and the maintenance of global instability, which are all elements of war and conflict, and of course, none of peace. So as the Philippines further integrates itself with this system or into this system, actually, 2 days ago, or 3 days ago, our military officials were quoted as saying that they want, if it was up to them, that the BrahMos missile system and the Typhoon missile system, which is already in the Philippines, will never leave. But of course, it's not up to them. But in that news article, it wasn't disclosed what was the reaction in turn of the U.S. government to those comments. In any case, the Philippines is risking being complicit to the cycle of violence, which is not only going to harm the Filipinos, but also, of course, poses a threat for the rest of Asia and the Pacific. In fact, it is not, as I said, it is not focusing on trying to resolve what are the basis of insecurity, which is poverty, inequality, but rather it is focusing its resources, however meager it is, to military spending and military preparedness. In fact, there are more than 18 security agreements with other countries in the pipeline, including NATO member countries. And this likewise includes the recently concluded Reciprocal Access Agreement, or RAA, between the Philippines and Japan. So, despite assurances that associating with NATO and the U.S. military-industrial complex will provide security, history reveals that militarism does not bring peace, as we know. It has exacerbated regional tensions, the weapons race, and the risk of conflict. We have already seen this in the recent history of the Philippines. Foreign military presence has weakened the Philippines' sovereignty and has disrupted peace. Unfortunately, the Marcos regime has managed to draw the country deeper into a power game of global superpowers rather than seeking peace, stability, and a foreign policy that emphasizes the well-being of its people. So, of course, the biggest thing we have to do here is to challenge the notion that militarism is the only solution to security by advocating non-alignment, diplomacy, and regional cooperation in foreign policy. Ideally, the Philippines should serve as a bridge for peace in the Asia-Pacific region, working it out with its ASEAN neighbors to foster mutual respect, dialogue, and shared prosperity. But unfortunately, that is a work in progress. On one hand, the Filipinos were able to develop a strong anti-bases and anti-militarism movement in the past. But now, this fervor has to be likewise imbibed by younger advocates in the face of aggressive, all-sided, pro-American messages in the mainstream and social media sphere. So, it likewise remains a challenge how we are going to push our government leaders to genuinely address the sources of insecurity and how they must make policy decisions that favor the Filipino people and not foreign powers or defense contractors. Finally, I urge that, of course, we remain committed to peace, justice, and sovereignty. And we will continue to exert our efforts to reject militarism's false promises of security in favor of a future based on diplomacy, collaboration, and human dignity. And to the Marcos administration, I would like to say militarism is not the route to peace. The Philippines deserves more than to be a pawn in a deadly global power game. The Philippines deserves a future where our children may grow in a world devoid of violence and conflict, a future with our sovereignty is respected and our people are really safe. So finally, I want to say, let us choose peace, let us choose diplomacy, let us choose a future where the Philippines stands as a beacon of hope, not a battleground for the ambitions of others. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your valuable insights, Ms. DJ, about NATO's growing presence in the Asia-Pacific, particularly in the Philippines. Your detailed discussion of the ongoing activities and geopolitical dynamics surrounding NATO's expansions was extremely informative. It was also especially helpful to understand how this expansion is impacting security and sovereignty, as well as the broader implications. I also appreciate the recommendations you mentioned toward the end of offering potential, strategies to counter these developments and explore possible alternatives for maintaining peace and stability in the region. I'm hearing about the various military initiatives, partnerships, and how NATO's involvement is reshaping the political landscape in the region has provided a clearer perspective on the challenges that we are facing in the region. Thank you very much for that. And allow me to introduce our next speaker. So we have Francis Daehoon Lee from Peace Momo. He has taught peace studies at Sung Kong Ho University, Ritsumeikan University, and the International University of Japan. He served as legal advisor to the UN Human Rights Subcommission in 2005 and worked with Korea's Center for Peace Museum. He's the former executive director of ARENA and director of Korea's Center for Peace and Disarmament. He coordinated SENA, a network of universities promoting peace, human rights, and democracy. Since 2006, Francis has facilitated UNESCO and APCEIU teacher training workshops and co-founded Peace Momo to train teachers and activists in peace education. He also directs the Trans Education for Peace Institute, or TEPI. You have the floor, Francis. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jean, for a nice introduction. Hello, I'm Francis, based in Seoul, South Korea. I'll be speaking on behalf of Peace Momo, policy advocacy, research, and training NGO, also based in Seoul. I'm going to start with a little bit of history of NATO expansion into the Asia Pacific. I think it's worthwhile to remember that the first proposal came in 2001 in NATO summit. We need to seek partners in Asia Pacific. That call came from very early in 2000. And about the same time, a few years later, Obama began to stress pivot to Asia, increase the presence of US military and political influence in Asia Pacific. It was 28 that NATO officially decided to invite Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, 4 countries. But they cannot be members of NATO because Asia Pacific is not North Atlantic. So they created a new program, individual country partnership program. They sometimes call it tailored individual program. So South Korea entered NATO structure through this individualized partnership program. So starting with high-level consultation and then summit, in 2022, starting from 22. So South Korea's involvement in NATO on the presidential level, the top level, is very new, 2022. And I think this year is very important because this is when the war in Ukraine was deepened into full-scale war. There was a change of government into ultra right-wing government in South Korea. Japan changed its security policy significantly and began to increase its budget, defense budget of one of the richest countries, Japan, from 2022. That's when South Korea, along with other countries, fully joined NATO. But another thing I'd like to note is that they are still not members of NATO. So what they do in NATO summit and on the consultation table are not directly translated into military activities in Northeast Asia or Asia Pacific. So what has been decided on NATO summit level is not, in terms of language, is not translated into NATO activities in Asia Pacific. But if we observe what is really happening in terms of military budget and exercises and mobilizations, the so-called interoperability that every military unit should be geared into the US military command so that the whole multinational forces can be operated as one unit under US command, interoperability. So if we observe these facts on the ground, NATO is really being formed in Asia Pacific, but without using the name NATO. So I think we need a kind of new name for how NATO expands into Asia Pacific. So these countries in Asia Pacific, they are not official members of NATO, but they behave as members of NATO. So I used to call this phenomena as NATO in disguise. And then one of my colleagues in Peace Movement came up with a new concept when she analyzed the militarization in South Korea. Young Moon, she used the concept militarization in camouflage. Militarization camouflage, because military and militarization and military culture are not popular anymore. But from the structure and from international relations, South Korea should continue its demilitarization. So they have to use camouflage, disguise. I think NATO is in the same fate. So I want to use a new concept, NATO in camouflage in the Asia Pacific. NATO expand not honestly, not clearly in this region, but only in camouflage. I think this has some implications for peace movements. I'll mention it later. As you know, China has been mentioned many times as a main structural threat, Russia a kind of immediate threat, and DPRK is mentioned and not mentioned, up and downs. And now, with this kind of changes, obviously happening since 2022, there was a change of DPRK, which is North Korea's policy towards the South. At the beginning of this year, and since the end of last year, DPRK declares we will abandon unification approach towards South Korea. We will abandon to consider South Korea as a part of the previously same nation. We will consider South Korea as two separate, antagonistic enemy countries. So no more peace talks, no more talks for unification, no more talks for disarmament. So there was a declaration from DPRK for the first time. And after that, when the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, was asked by a Russian diplomat, do you think war is likely coming in the Korean Peninsula? And he said that DPRK sees that way a real war is coming very soon, and DPRK is ready to counter any war aggression with all physical methods, including nuclear weapons. And this is not the first time that any country in Northeast Asia declared the preemptive or first use of nuclear weapons. The US has been using nuclear weapons implied military exercises in US Korea exercises, US-Japan military exercises. And it is a fact today that US has abandoned no first strike policy of their nuclear weapons. So with the DPRK joining this club of no first strike policy, and South Korea and Japan deeply integrated into US military institution, now there's no guarantee, no provisions to prevent any war from happening, and that war having nuclear weapons. So this is a situation, but I think we need to expand our understanding of South Korea's role into NATO expansion a little bit more clearly. Let me do one thing. I'd like to compare the size of military training by NATO in Europe and the size of military exercise between South Korea and the US alone. Okay. When NATO, with 32 member states, had the largest combined military exercise this year for 5 months this year in Europe, the number of forces they mobilized was about 90,000. and number of naval ships they mobilized was about 50, and number of fighter airplanes and other forms of air weapons is about 80. Okay, so keep this number in mind. And that was the largest NATO exercise in Europe. And now this year, for 11 days only, the joint exercise between South Korea and the US mobilized South Korea 300,000 forces and US 40,000 forces, South Korea 300,000 forces. Okay, this is just 1 year exercise for 11 days between two countries, South Korea and US, and the size and the money spent is more than 5 times than the largest military exercise of NATO. So that's what I imply by NATO in camouflage. Okay? It's not just another regional NATO happening in Northeast Asia and Indo-Pacific. This is a much larger scale. This is much more serious. This is much more serious arms race. And this is much more waste of money, tax money, happening right here in Northeast Asia and larger Asia Pacific. And then for the first time in history, this year in June, the US and Japan, South Korea had the first trilateral military exercises, okay? So if you just add two countries, it becomes the largest military mobilization in the world. Now Japan, one of the richest countries, and with its plan to increase its military budget to a double scale in less than 4 years from now, the three countries have joined in full-scale interoperable military exercise for the first time this year. Interoperable means that three national militaries are joined to US command as one unit. And the mobilization of naval ships, airplanes, and satellites, and intelligence, and ground forces are just beyond belief, beyond belief. And let me cite one more fact about Japan. I think when we consider the topic of NATO expansion, and especially NATO expansion in camouflage, we should pay real good attention to Japan. Not only they are one of the richest countries, but it's also highly militarized countries, and they have decided to militarize even more, even faster. And since 2007, they adopted a policy paper called The Vision of a Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Free and open Indo-Pacific, and they're expanding their joint military exercises with India, with Australia, with Pakistan, and with Federated States of Micronesia, and with India again, and with the Netherlands, and Canada and New Zealand in Asia Pacific, and with Palau, and with Vietnam, and with Germany. This is Japan's single-handed joint military exercises and joint investment and joint training of interoperability in the Asia Pacific. So I like to stress that the scope of militarization and the scope of arms race has fundamentally changed. And the Asia Pacific is the first region of experiencing this first fundamental mega change in the name of NATO expansion. This is another scale, this is another level, and this is another level of wasting money. And this has deep implications for our ability to handle climate crisis, our ability to maintain democracy, and our ability to maintain any hopeful future. So I'd like to end my short talk with emphasizing like 6 points. Okay? NATO had to come and expand into even more higher scale in the Asia Pacific to guarantee global supremacy of the US and Western power. But they were able to come only in camouflage, not in the name of NATO. So these crazy concepts like greed of alliances, and this is a security cooperation, not alliances kind of talk. This kind of chaotic talk of the policymakers in NATO also suggest that they are having difficulties of manifesting NATO expansion in Asia Pacific. So there is a clash. NATO is not welcome, NATO is not popular, NATO does not have legitimacy, legal, anything in the Asia Pacific, but they want to push for it. I think peace movement should dig into this gap. NATO is here, but they pretend NATO is not here. They want to use other forms. We have to dig into this contradiction, the camouflage of militarization and camouflage of military race. Because most of people around the world, they have different thoughts, they have different directions, they have different judgment. So my last part, 3 points about proposals. I think we need a kind of new peace movement networks, including watchtower, over this camouflaged NATO expansion in Asia Pacific. This is a new phenomena, and this is very serious scale. So we need a new approach to this phenomena. And one thing is clear, there's no independent single country approach to NATO expansion issue. The militarization in South Korea is not about South Korea. The crisis of democracy is not about South Korea. Peace in Japan doesn't make sense. Japan is already deeply involved in the offensive military structure called NATO. So peace in single country, peace building in single country doesn't make any sense anymore. So single country-based peace strategy or peace movement, I think it's very weak. We need to go beyond a single country approach. We need to have more regional and global action platforms to counter this move of the US and Western power in the Asia Pacific. And at the same time, I think like stop the war and oppose the war, this agenda is also not so concrete in the 21st century in the Asia Pacific, because the possibility of major war breaking out is much more imminent than ever. And these military exercises are not same exercises, and we need to reconceptualize military training and military exercise as a de facto provocation of warfare. Our concept of war and preparation of war have to change. So therefore, I think we as a collective peace movement should focus on preventing the imminent war preparation by the major powers, including NATO. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. That's very elaborate, very clear as well. Like not only for South Korea and also the implications that's in Japan, which is very neighboring with South Korea as well. And I think the word for today is the NATO in camouflage. I think you also capture the very essence of this webinar, why we are doing this, because not all people know what's happening in Asia Pacific and what's NATO doing in Asia Pacific. It's not very well known in public. So through this webinar, we're also like to raise awareness that there are in there, but just through other forms. So I could not further re-echo your voice of having new approaches and also the reality, democratizing it's not only a concern of a single state, but it's also a collective concerns that we have right now in Asia Pacific. And thank you so much for giving us your in-depth perspectives on this issue. And now we're going back to another close area in Asia Pacific. We'll have for our next speaker, Professor Dr. Teresa Ariola from Commonwealth. So Professor Isa, if I may call you that, was born and raised on the islands of Saipan in the northern Mariana Islands. So she's also a cultural anthropologist who earned her PhD from University of California at Los Angeles. She is also an assistant professor in sociology and anthropology department at Concordia University. So her research and activism focus on the contemporary demilitarization movements through the Marianas in response to U.S. militarization in the archipelago to answer geopolitical regional tensions. So she currently also chairs a committee advocacy group on Saipan named Our Commonwealth, wherein they advocate to educate the community about militarization in the Marianas. So without further ado, I'll give a floor to Professor Isa. Thank you for being with us today.
Hafa day, everybody, and thank you, Michelle, for that warm greeting, and thank you for inviting me to be here to talk today. I have to say I'm really encouraged and inspired by all of the speakers that have gone so far, and it's just kind of reminding me of this commitment that we all need to have to each other to have this really deep regional analysis about these issues, right? Because we really can't rely on what NATO's saying. We have to rely on our own experiences, you know, with what we're seeing in the region. And so I just want to give my thanks and gratitude for the conversation that's been had so far. I have some slides that I wanted to share. And so Michelle, please feel free to share them on the screen if you have access to them. Are you able? Okay. So as Michelle mentioned, I'm currently in Saipan, which is my home island in the Northern Mariana Islands. And just to give you some context, we are a U.S. Commonwealth and in the same archipelago as our sister island Guam, which is just 45 minutes to the south. And so a lot of our experiences overlap in a lot of different ways, but it is important to contextualize my own experience and my own work within the Northern Mariana Islands, right? Although we are two distinct political entities. So we are, as I mentioned, we are a Commonwealth, and Guam is on the UN's list of non-self-governing territories, right? It's still a colony of the United States. So, you know, this idea that you have just brought up, Francis, about NATO and camouflage is really, I think, so key to even the way that we understand NATO's involvement in this region. To be quite honest with you, many of the folks that I asked about what NATO's involvement is in the region really simply couldn't answer that question. And I think it was because of exactly what you're saying, right? We just have to dig a little bit deeper. So the treaty doesn't explicitly extend its protections to U.S. territories and its possessions in the Indo-Pacific under Article 5, for example. So if territories and island nations were attacked, there would be really no requirement for NATO to respond. So we're in a bit of a geopolitical no man's land in terms of the treaty, if we're looking at what our involvement is with NATO. But the article also does make a pledge to the alliance's collective response if a NATO ally is under attack, right? And it also just leaves this kind of gaping hole open about what do we do with the U.S. affiliated Pacific Island states like Palau, like FSM, like the Marshall Islands, right? While the U.S. considers them part of Homeland Defense, they're also in these gray zones in terms of the treaty. So, and this is oh, you can go to the next slide. Sorry, Michelle. Thank you. And so this is concerning, right? Because Hawaii and Guam, and really the rest of the Marianas, I would argue, are at the core of much of the U.S. military's posturing in the region to address China's, military power and this perceived North Korean threat. And so I'll tell you a bit about what this map is. But so although NATO's strategic approach in the Indo-Pacific doesn't include the deployment of troops, or again, really piggybacking of what you had just mentioned, Francis, of a formal military presence, it's of course its focus is on these key security areas, especially in terms of economic and cyber stability, and really solidifying these spheres of influence with allies in the region. And this is supposed to be a deterrent strategy, right? But I'll show you some examples of this uptick in militarization that we're seeing in the Mariana Islands and why it's causing concern for the public who worry about how this increased military planning is actually making us a larger target for war, right? It's actually increasing the dangers that we're seeing on our island. And if you don't already know this, the entire Marianas Archipelago, including the land, sea, and the sky, has been turned into the Mariana Islands Training and Testing Study Area, which is just under 1 million square nautical miles. And I just want to remind everybody that this actually was doubled in 2015. So you can see originally what the size of this MIT, what they call the MIT is, right? All of these terms that really naturalize all of this militarization too. I really want to try to kind of, break through even the way we are looking at these terms, right? We are literally called a study area. That's problematic. So, activities that occur within the MIT are anything from strike warfare to amphibious warfare training, assaults, live fire trainings, you name it. This is part of, bombing. This is part of the MIT study area for the Pentagon. Okay, next slide. Thank you so much, Michelle. So I just want to show you some of the ways that we are experiencing this hyper-militarization in the region. And I'm just giving you really kind of like personal accounts about how this plays out. And so these are newspaper clippings and, just news photo that I took. We consume largely US media out here primarily. So, largely as the result of the Pacific pivot, which was also previously mentioned under the Obama administration, it's currently being accelerated by these urgent geopolitical tensions. We're experiencing the largest U.S. defense design, construction, supply, and service initiatives basically in recent history. And these are some of the kind of examples of the threats that we're seeing that the U.S. says it's responding to in the newspapers. At the same time that the national news is covering these incidents, they've really become kind of naturalized as part of our everyday realities, as you can see with the governor's response here on the then governor's response, whose advice was after North Korea had put out plans to strike Guam with the missile. He said, go on with your daily lives, right? So these provocations have proven to be really important forms of justification for further militarization in the Mariana Islands, for example, including things like activating new bases on Guam, like the Marine Corps base, Camp Blas, and as you'll see in a moment, the creation of a divert airfield on Tinian Island that I'll show you a photo of. Next slide. So this is just another example that I wanted to highlight, and this is a short video. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it. Hopefully it plays, but in May 2022, there was a convoy operations on Saipan. So this is on the island of Saipan, and it was conducted by the Naval Surface Warfare Center with tactical military vehicles. It paraded basically 4 oversized semi-trucks with what they called simulated high vehicle targets on board on a flatbed system platform. So that's the terminology that's used, right? But this was just, again, this is one of those sound the alarm moments where, we were told the public should not be alarmed. The HVTs were simulations, and they were supposed to be acting as opposing forces from China or North Korea, for example, right? And this piece of the training was intended to refine defense communication capabilities. And also static displays of these HVTs, which they call them, were also on display for the community to come and see, which is a tactic that is often used, very much naturalizes the militarization that we're experiencing on the island. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the island of Tinian was also chosen as a divert airfield in the event that Guam's infrastructure was no longer usable. So basically, if Guam gets bombed out, where do they go? Well, our island's next, right? Just look up north. And so, 2/3 of Tinian is already under lease by the Pentagon for military activities. But this divert airfield is quite alarming, in part because there's a lot of different like infrastructural projects associated with it, like roads and things like that. But there's also a fuel pipeline that's supposed to go underground that connects the seaport to the airport, and that runs over the island's only potable source of water. Okay, so and it's also alarming for the fact that you're seeing this remilitarization of this island that was once used to house the atomic bombs, right? When we grow up, we go to those memorial pits, right? To see where those bombs were stored before they were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? So you're seeing this remilitarization of the island of Tinian, and people are desperate for this level of militarization because of the economic situation that we find ourselves in right now, right? Which is not looking very good. Next slide, please. And I think I'll just end here and I'll just sum up here. But so this is a photo of a picture of a Japan Air Self-Defense Force airmen conducting tropical survival training to better operate apparently as a combined force in the Indo-Pacific region. And this was happening during Cope North at Andersen Air Force Base. But so I just want, I'll leave this photo here, but in some, what we're seeing is these major investments in this joint force training and all of these different war games that use Guam and the rest of the Marianas Archipelago as a kind of base of operations, from which the Pentagon can train with Japan, with Canada, with France, with Australia and South Korea. One of the war maneuver that I just mentioned, and I don't like to call it exercise, right? Because again, it's more than that, is Cope North, which had approximately 2,400 service members and 85 aircraft that participated just recently in this exercise, and they expended over 30,000 pounds of ordnance into the ocean with no remediation. There's no plan to clean that up, right? So yeah, so this particular maneuver was established in 1978 as a bilateral exercise, and it's since grown into a trilateral exercise in 2012. And now includes the Royal Australian Air Force. So, and of course, right, I don't need to say this to this group, but I mean, just to reiterate, right, there's also RIMPAC, which we all know is the largest naval war exercise in the world. And it's notable that 1/3 of the countries that participate in that, as retired Colonel Ann Wright has mentioned, are actually not from the Pacific, but from NATO Europe countries. So I want to, again, I just want to close by reiterating what I said earlier, which was, again, NATO's strategic approach in the Indo-Pacific it doesn't include necessarily this form of military presence, but we see that NATO is an accelerant, right? It's accelerating U.S. militarization at again, mind-boggling rates in the region, as a cornerstone of its influence in the region among its allies. And this is why we're witnessing this hyper militarization of the archipelago that's taking place, especially as the U.S. continues to welcome these growing contributions to the global security conversation from NATO's Indo-Pacific partners. The danger, of course, again, this doesn't have to be said again, but just again to reiterate what everyone has been talking about, is that, of course, the fear is that it will fuel potential conflict, right? It's not bringing security. We all know this. In the midst of all of this war preparation, we're also still awaiting in our own community one of the largest plans to be environmental impact statements, called the CNMI Joint Military Training Project. We're still actually awaiting the update about those plans. And this is a very important plan because it was so vehemently resisted by the community when it came out originally in the mid-2000s, that the Pentagon actually had to go back to the drawing board and redo this one environmental impact statement for this major military project that we're going to be seeing upcoming. So I want to echo the previous speakers and again also, push back on this idea that we have no other choice except to prepare for war for another country again. Because of our strategic location, that gives us no other choice but to be prepped for war constantly, right? and that sovereignty and self-determination of our indigenous peoples need to be the guiding principle behind these geopolitical conversations, and how we, really should not, again, be prioritizing military goals that are quite literally leading us nowhere, right? Possibly to death. So again, my thanks, and I'll end there, and hopefully we can continue the conversation after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Teresa. All right. Yeah, I'm unmuting. All right. Thank you very much again, once again, for your very insightful presentations on NATO's activities in the Mariana Archipelago. Your in-depth analysis of, the geopolitical shifts and the increasing military presence in the region has given us a clear understanding of what's really happening on the ground, and, how alarming it is. So thank you very much for that once again. And to proceed to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Anuradha Chenoy. She is an adjunct professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs, Jinda Global University. She retired as professor and dean of the School of International Studies in New Delhi after many years as an engaged scholar. She completed her studies with scholarships from the Indian Council for Social Science Research and Fulbright Fellowship, University of Columbia in New York. She is actively engaged with the Asia-Europe People's Forum, Transnational Institute, and the International Peace Bureau. Professor Chenoy, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, IPB. I'm, as usual, very honored to be here. And I think I'd had a great learning experience from all the co-panelists. Thank you all. It was really excellent. So what I've been asked to do, and I'm going to do, is not talk about NATO or the militarization, because it's all there, evident, but the I'm going to talk about 5 responses from Asia Pacific to this militarization. 4 are from the state and 1 from civil society. So these 5. And within the 4 state, there are first 2 types of responses. The first type is very similarly from Australia and South Korea. And that is, they have linked, or what is called, very often called in international relations discourse, as bandwagoning with US security positions. Of course, I'm very impressed at the way the Australian Labour Party former Prime Minister and leaders, I've heard some of their YouTube, have actually tried to challenge the mainstream discourse on AUKUS. But I haven't seen the same thing from South Korea in terms of state actors. So therefore, there is very heavy militarization coming from Australia into Australia and South Korea. South Korea even more, because there's very little resistance. And in international relations, it is state power which really matters. But what is also happening is there is not just camouflage militarization, which I agree with what Francis said, but there is also strategic mirroring. That is, they're not, and there's a strategic forgetfulness. They're not even looking at how the theater of conflict was constructed in Europe. And when we thought Europe was so free of conflict, when we thought the EU was a final kind of place where there would be, now the EU and the US is at war within the conflict, though they try to separate, though Europe is trying to think they're part of the US, but they cannot deny their geography. So this theater of conflict was built in Ukraine for years. And a similar thing, I think, is happening for the Philippines and South Korea, where this theater of conflict is in the process of construction. We don't know how long this construction will take, but I just saw day before yesterday that the US Naval Command officer, who's a woman, she said she sees a conflict. She actually said a confrontation with China in 2027. So she actually pinpointed the year. And this is the head of the US Naval Command and posted in the Asia Pacific. So it is rather unnerving, and I would be very unnerved to be, especially either in Philippines or North Korea, because the US is using several, I would say, tactics, and these countries in their response, they're allowing this camouflaging, they are mirroring the strategic fear of China, and they're not connecting the dots, or they're not at least allowing people to connect the dots between what is happening with NATO in the West, with what is proposed for NATO in the Asia Pacific. The second response is counter-militarization from Russia and China. Sorry. So it's not just NATO which is militarizing. There's a counter-militarization also, not at the same scale, but nonetheless it's there. And you could see it in the North Korea-Russia comprehensive strategic agreement, in which one of the clauses says that they would assist each other in case of a conflict. It is very ambiguous, but nonetheless it's there. It doesn't say what it means. It is not like Article 5 of NATO, but it is a movement towards that. And China now, the Chinese naval forces have overtaken, in terms of technology and strength, the US naval forces and technologies and submarines in the Asia Pacific. So both sides are equally prepared. Though, of course, both China and Russia are repeatedly saying they do not want to see any war, that they would like diplomacy. But I think with US has got so used to this unilateralism since the 1990s and being the only superpower, they've buried diplomacy 9 feet under. I don't see them having diplomacy anywhere. They give diktats, for sure. And they have a court where they meet, visiting diplomats. Currently, Blinken is holding that at the UN. So that is a second response, and very quickly. Then the third response is from countries like India, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and others in ASEAN. I'm not saying ASEAN because Philippines doesn't have the same response. So these countries have a very interesting response, and that is they're beginning to assert their strategic autonomy. That is, they engage with the US. They're not saying the US is a threat. They're not saying the US is an enemy like China does. You know, China is directly confronting the hegemon all the time. But these countries say that, you know, it's in our benefit to engage, and they all have strategic partnerships with the US, but they also have strategic partners with Russia and China. So Vietnam has a very close strategic partnership with China, despite the fact that some of its areas of the in its around its seas are disputed. And I went to some of the islands which where you have these Chinese boats which confront the Vietnamese fisher boats. So there is confrontation, there is fear, there is threat. In Vietnam, for example, I was told that nobody buys a Chinese laptop because of that security fear that they would hack it, etc. So there is fear, but there's controlled. There is also this thing that Vietnam will assert its autonomy. They will engage with China and they will engage with the US also on their own terms. And they have these 4 no's in their constitution, no to military bases, no to aligning with any country which is involved in a war with superpowers, etc. It's very interesting, I think. And of course, Malaysia and Indonesia are similar, and India has a strategic balancing act between Russia and the US all the time. So they are very closely tied to the US. They have opposed sanctions on Russia, sorry. They have, not vocally, but in very sophisticated language, they have not criticized the Ukraine war at all. Not once have they said it's a war of aggression. They have said repeatedly in the UN that the strategic interests of Russia should be considered. And in negotiations, both sides should be present. And that we, along with others in the global south, are willing to support this Ukraine-Russia negotiation. Similarly with China, the Indian response has been, because the US is always putting pressure on India, that with a lot of their very high-profile State Department people coming, national security advisors, etc., who keep saying, that China is going to attack, or that Russia will not support you if China attacks. And repeatedly, India has said two things. One, we don't have the NATO mentality. Two, we are capable of bilaterally solving these issues. So this is their strategic autonomy. I'm not saying it's the best thing. It's not one for peace, because India's had its own border issues with both Pakistan and China. It's hegemonic with others. So I'm not saying this is an ideal foreign policy. All I'm doing is explaining the different responses. The next response is of the regional powers, and I think that's very important, even though sometimes we are disappointed with them. For example, ASEAN's response, or especially the ASEAN and there's other smaller forums, BIMSTEC, there's the Asia Peace conferences, there's the economic APEC, and various smaller ones. And all these know that they need to also engage with China. China is a regional partner. It's on the region. So, and the US is at distance. It's a great power. We don't want to have we don't want to have a confrontation, but we cannot disassociate from the region. So whether it's a Mekong region or others, the regional associations, and I think it would be good for Australia to start thinking of linking up with some of these regional associations also, because ultimately they are a part of the Asia-Pacific region. And the last response is that from the peace movements, civil society movements, and climate movements, which is the ideal response, and they're carrying it on their shoulders, like this webinar. And now there is the BRICS with it, which is of the emerging powers. And that is the fastest institution building of the global south, of the global majority outside the West. Of course, it's not a military alliance at all, and nor will it ever be. It doesn't have a coordinating center. It opposes hegemony, and it is built a new development bank, and it promotes the use of local currencies, etc. I don't have time to go into it, but I'm writing something on it, which I can send you all. So really, it's civil society's work. And I really like, again, what Francis said, that we should have a peace watchtower, like a lighthouse. We can't do very much more, which warns of these ships. And I think we should do it with precisely these associations together, like today. Expand it with IPAN, with IPB, with Peace Momo, with whoever is willing, put in some resources and because what happens is that many of us think that we are the only ones suffering this peace or insecurity or militarization, but you can see the commonality of experience. You can see the commonality of examples. So we need to have this collective watchdog together in some way, whatever way. It can be evolved. It can be a very creative process. Maybe IPB, if they have some way of supporting it, because they have an institution. So does Francis, quite frankly. And so we should have this together with Australia, with New Zealand, with all those who are willing, with the peace movements internationally, because they're playing a great role on Gaza, on Lebanon. It's heartbreaking for us to see what is happening to our brothers and sisters in the West Bank, in Gaza, and now in Lebanon. And we need to bring this information, because what is happening there is really a struggle for national liberation, a struggle against decolonization, a struggle for multipolarity, a struggle against unipolarity. And this is all a lot of the Western supports against who? It's against non-state actors. This Hamas and Hezbollah, they're all non-state actors, and they're fighting it out alone with their blood and bodies. So we don't want this to be repeated. We want to support this morally and this legitimate force. Because of social media, we are able to do it. So really, this is what I'm appealing for, that civil society is already doing a lot, but it will have to do more. We have no choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Anu. I think I couldn't agree more that we should do more. And I think many of our participants also today would like to ask questions from our speakers. So I invite again all the speakers on the floor for our Q&A. Yeah. Yeah. Jean, do you like to start the ball rolling? Do you have
All
any
right.
questions?
Thank you very much, Michelle. Once again, thank you very much to all our speakers for coming and joining us in this webinar. Maybe as a youth advocate, I wanted to ask our speakers, how can they, involve more youth into this discussion about, the overall defense and security? Because like coming from the Philippines, this is something that is not as common as compared, let's say, to Europe or to other countries. And so I wanted to ask, how can we involve more youth into the discussion? Anyone could go first? Or can I address this to
I
Miss
guess I
Ajay, since
like
she is
to.
from the Philippines? Oh, there you go. And
Yeah, look, I think we all need to recognize that we've seen a massive youth peace movement develop in response to the atrocities being committed in Gaza and now Lebanon. And every rally I go to, the connections are made by the speakers about the unipolarity, the projection of the United States hegemon. So, I think it's really important that we work with this emergent movement that exists, and certainly we will be doing that at the IPAN conference, including what's happening in the Middle East very significantly into the conference. Yeah. So I don't know about others, if that movement has happened in the Philippines? Do we see that in India, Anu, and in the Republic of Korea, Francis? I mean,
In India, there has been some, it's very curbed, because dissent is being curbed very hard in India. People who have had demonstrations, or we've had demonstrations on the issue of Gaza, a lot of them. But generally, the government is trying to either, they put pressure, they won't allow it. But a lot of students and young people are definitely, they definitely know what is happening. And I think one way of involving the youth is using their methodologies. And they use a lot of social media. They use a lot of, they listen a lot to YouTube. I see that they don't read newspapers. But so I think we need to engage with these young YouTubers. And some of these alternate media channels, which I saw one from Japan called Neutrality Studies, and it gets like 30,000 or 100,000 views. So it must be young people. And I've seen one from Thailand called the New Atlas. It's run by a retired Marine officer, or he retired, or he left the Marines or something. And again, he kind of deconstructs. He's a strong anti-imperialist American, but he has a lot of views. And this Japan person, he teaches in the University of, one of the universities of Japan. It's called Neutrality Studies. And I came to know of it because he asked me to speak on it also. And what I spoke on was regime change in Bangladesh and Pakistan. I thought nobody's going to be interested in Japan, but 30,000 people watched it. So these, I think we should push into this. And of course, there are language issues for all of us. But there's easy translation. So we should use social media and encourage the younger people to start these channels and maybe join them whenever they ask us. Thanks.
Maybe to the conversation. I agree that we should craft what we're saying to the medium that is popular. As said by Anu earlier. At the same time, I think we need to connect it with what it is that they value. In the Philippines, there are surveys that came out that young people value advocacies that are clearly, the goal is clear. For instance, environment. You know what you're going against. You know what you want. So if they put in effort, they can see what will happen. I think the challenge here is because we are talking about things that are not necessarily, things are either going on or will happen in the future. We have to make it as clear as possible that these things are real. They are not, they're not nebulous. It will happen because no force is going against it. So that's my take on. But I do agree that the traction created by the outpouring of solidarity for the Palestine people is something that we should maximize at this juncture, really, for all, because that can open doors and for the peace and the anti-militarism movement.
Michelle Todd,
Yeah. I'm about to call Tord. Thank you for the responses earlier. Tord, you can ask away your question for our speakers today, and to whom you would like to address your question to as well. Tord, may you kindly open your mic, please? Yeah, perfect.
Now you hear me. I hope so.
Perfect.
I'm very impressed by this panel, and it's utmost important to know what's happening in different parts of the world. I live in the country Sweden, which had 200 years of successful peace policy thrown in the basket in a very short time. And the worst warmongers, it seems like now, is the left party. They are more for long-distance missiles. They want to close the Baltic Sea for Russian shipping, etc., etc. And we see the same thing with the Greens in Germany. They are the worst in Europe. So with other words, the middle-class movement that developed in the 80s, the peace and environmental movement, have now in their political party formations become the worst. This was very clearly already in the Libya war, which also totally destroyed not only North Africa, but as we know, West Africa and all these tensions going on. It seems like the same thing is very disturbing with this development in Japan and South Korea. As we know, Japan has been the most strongest sort of peace movement globally since the 1950s. And as that breaking down, the same thing happened in Germany, who's also been a very strong sort of nation against all warmongering. But we have to also understand that this opens new realities. We had yesterday a big event in Stockholm in the main church, the Free Church, where we have all the big climate meetings and all the mainstream groups, the climate, the big conservation society have chapters in every municipality in Sweden. And the biggest peace organization, who's growing very fast now with 17,000 members, the Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society, established in the 19th century. So suddenly the issue of peace is turned into something that one had to discuss also in the climate movement, which means that there's a much opening, of course, for any kind of issues in terms of interest. I'm opposing very much the idea that what we have to do is to be very single focused if we want to have the youth. I think it's the opposite. I think at the time we need this global understanding and linking it, of course, to our daily realities, but that's the way forward. And 2 days ago, there was an excellent webinar organized by War Sisters International with 6 speakers, if I remember correctly. 5 of them were young. And all of them were focused on the connections between peace and climate issues, etc. So there's a growing understanding of the need of linking Gaza, linking the need for addressing that anti-colonization is ended, and that is very precisely in the Western Sahara, because our present world order needs food. And 50% of the phosphate is in Western Sahara and Morocco. And that is why, for the first time, officially, the West is now destroying anti-colonization as an official goal. Starting, of course, with the US and Trump, and then, of course, with Macron lately as well, and, of course, supported by Ukraine and Israel, of course. So we have to start to address the total combination of the issues. And then, of course, make them very specific as well. This is the trick. So my question, which I posed yesterday,
Thank you, Tart.
was, is it possible to start a mass movement in the East, Russia, China, etc., in the global South and the West for disarmament, for welfare and environment?
Thank you. Is there any specific person that you would like to address that question?
Well, it's up to it's up
Okay.
to the speakers.
To any our speakers would like to address that and to take on that?
Because I sense both Australia and Francis Lee were speaking about that the context is that now the militarization takes away all the resources for any hope to solve the climate crisis, any hope for any welfare. So it's linked in that way.
Thank you, Tart. I think Francis, you opened your mic. You would like to share something?
With our common understanding of the situation, social situation in China and also DPRK, I think it would be safe to imagine it will be very difficult to have a discussion on the connection between disarmament and welfare with the public in many of the Northeast Asian countries. And also in South Korea, there is a kind of a taboo to connect arms issues with social issues. I'd like to explain why from my own perspective. East Asia is a region still where one of the strongest statist paradigm that state is the supreme and holy power that you cannot cross over. Statist thinking is prevalent in the most strongest form. If you want to choose a region, I will choose East Asia, where the statist belief, faith, is still alive very much in the public mind. So disarmament, arms, militarization, US-South Korea alliance, international relations, these are state affairs. I can discuss about social welfare policies with my free mind and with the liberal rights. But I'm reluctant on disarmament issues. That kind of distinction is very, very strong. So I don't see a kind of public-based or mass-based campaign or international solidarity on these issues in near future.
Yeah, I might just add that, I think it would not be, we would not really make any headway were we to talk about disarmament in Australia. I think the narrative of, and the historical lack of our colonial history really, where we have been self-perceived as a white nation, despite the existence of Indigenous people for 60,000 years. With colonization, the whole sort of idea and fear of being a white nation in a hostile area is so deeply embedded, it would be very difficult to talk about disarmament as such. I think we've got more prospect of working with the concerns about America or any other nation actually using us as a military base, rather than, we need to really actually accept that the need for a defense force, for example, is very deeply embedded in the Australian psyche. Yeah.
I
Thank
think
you.
it's true for all of the global South. They're going to link with global disarmament. It's not going to be local, because they feel too insecure as states, and people support their states because they've seen that what happens to failed states, to disintegrated states. So even if they're, fundamentally anti-imperialist or they want to balance, they would like a kind of a global disarmament, and then they can join that. And so I think it's very important for, and actually the whole climate movement is now talking about climate and militarization. They want to know what is the impact of the military and the air forces and on climate, which has been a holy cow. No one wants to talk about it from the military. Those are not figures which are available on the emissions from the military. But the climate activists, who are the best activists world over today, they're asking for that. And that's a major step forward. And I don't think that one should be too hopeless about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. Do you have any take on it, Professor Isa?
Yeah, no, I am in total agreement here, but just that, again, we're seeing a lot of pushback too in the ways that increased militarization means increased environmental exemptions, right? Less oversight. All of these things are impacting the way we breathe, the way we eat, right? So this is where people are starting, and youth especially are starting to see this all kind of connect, right? And I think I just want to mention, at least for here, right, we have very, very high recruitment rates, especially in comparison to national rates in the United States of our high school students. They recruit heavily in our high schools. And so what's helped is for the younger generation to really be in tune with their own culture and their language, which is a struggle in a highly militarized, Americanized, colonized archipelago. But it gives the youth you know, what DJ was saying really resonated with me, because I just recently did a values survey in our community, and what came back was that people felt most disrespected when their language and their culture could not be shared or was disrespected, you know, was not acknowledged, right? So when the youth feel that they can connect and they can root themselves, they know what they're fighting for, right? They know who they are, so they know what they're fighting for. And that's been really critical, I think, to you know, a broader conversation about demilitarization. It comes slowly, but this is where I'm seeing some change.
Thank you for all your comments. I hope we could have more time for the Q&A. This is such a very interesting conversations. But I'm sorry, Torts, you're like quite running out of time, and I would like also to respect the time of all our speakers here and our participants. I would like to quickly acknowledge as well Paul Ingram's comments on the chat box that about his participation on the latest NATO's conference in Europe, and also his call for global movements as well. As I've mentioned, our speakers in Asian context, it's quite different. We are also facing different different conflicts happening within our countries as well. So the call for the global movement for disarmament and for environment that's happening right now and we're doing right now is on solidarity with all the participants and speakers today. So just like to ask one round of your final thoughts, just quick final thoughts or final words for our participants today that are watching us globally around the globe. I think I'll just do this alphabetically. We'll start with Miss Annette. Could you just yes, Miss Annette. So, so Annette, could you just share final thoughts very quick?
Very quick. It's been a really great conversation, and I really appreciate the opportunity to hear so many different analyses and looking to the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Annette. Professor Anu?
Yeah, I think I gained a lot, you know, from listening to everyone. And I'm grateful to IPB for having got such a wide, because very often we don't get to hear, especially from these islands, like, and from people like Isa. So thank you very much.
I would like to also thank AEPF, our co-organizer for this event. Also, for our next, Miss DJ, final thoughts?
Again, thank you for the opportunity, and we are hope that we can collaborate more in the future. I think we need more conversations like this, so that we have more common ground, and especially strategizing how can we communicate peace in this very conflicted, conflict ridden times. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss DJ. Sir Francis, any final thoughts for today?
Yes, I repeat, I really appreciated today's exchange. It's a great gathering and discussion organized by IPB and Asia Europe People's Forum. Thank you. And what I want to do is just stress the imminence of a great clash, big clash, war, and our mission to prevent it. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Isa?
Yes, just a Sidus Maasi, and thank you to the organizers and for bringing us together for this conversation. You know, we're talking about all the ways that we can make these connections for others, but I think we need these connections for ourselves sometimes too. So I'm very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And for our the organizer behind this is actually our co-president in IPB, Miss Cora Fabros. Do you have any final thoughts for for our webinar today? Thank you for leading this conversation as well and bringing us together in this platform.
No, I think we should thank our colleagues in the Berlin office who have worked very hard, you know, following up each and every one of you, including myself. It's been a pleasure to be able to bring you together. I mean, this is not very often that we can do this, and we're hoping that, you know, picking up from what our resource persons new ideas and, of course, new challenges are there. And therefore, please expect that we will follow up with you in the future, and so that we could bring together more energies and more inspiration, I should say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cora. And of course, my co-moderator for today, my fellow young activist from the Philippines, Jean, any final thoughts? I would learn a lot from this event. I don't know about you, but this is such an insightful event for me.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much for having me as well, Michelle, and to the IPB. It was really excellent to be hearing from all the speakers here, and to hear all those uh the actual thing that's happening on the ground, because we often hear it from the news, but to be able to hear it from experts and from those who are really knowledgeable about what's happening, that's really excellent. And I'm also grateful that we have discussed how to further involve youth. And I think Professor Chenoy mentioned earlier about social media and reaching out to for further advocacy on this matters. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you so much for everyone. Thank you so much for all our participants as well, and for those who are watching us via live stream. Thank you for joining us in this event. Hopefully you can learn one or two from our webinar, and we open our platform in IPB for future conversations, collaborations on this topic. And also our fellow participants here have posted their links on where you can reach them as well. So please feel free to reach us if you have any comments or follow up after this webinar. And hopefully we can continue these discussions on further promoting demilitarization and peace in Asia Pacific. Thank you so much and have a great